Hello and welcome to the final presentation of the Fall 2018 season of the Medical History Interest Group. I'm Marlena Barber, Assistant Director of Collections and Historical Services here at Lapis Library. The Medical History Interest Group presentations are sponsored by the Lapis Library History Collections and the Department of Bioethics and Interdisciplinary Studies. If you haven't already done so, please sign the attendance sheet before you leave. We are in the process of planning our Spring 2019 lecture series, which will be during a year-long celebration that commemorates our library's 50th anniversary. One of our presentations will be about how the concept of autism has expanded and changed over time. We invite you to take a look at our other exhibits in the library. Here on the fourth floor, we have scientists and their microscopes over there, which shows various microscopes in our collection with images of well-known scientists who use the same versions in their research. In the gallery space, we have the exhibit, The Spanish Influenza is Here, Memories of the 1918 Influenza Epidemic in Eastern North Carolina. This display includes the materials in the cases and also a story map on the touch table and on the iPad kiosk. The Country Doctor Museum has been part of the Lapis Health Sciences Collections and Historical Services since 2003, but we've been open in Bailey, North Carolina since December 8, 1968. The museum has they've been celebrating their 50th anniversary this past year. In our reading room in the history collections, we have a display to commemorate the anniversary. And this year, on December 8th, we will be offering free admission to the museum and refreshments in celebration, and we hope you can make it. We also have two exhibits on the second floor, Battle Creek Sanitarium, Food Safety, and the FDA. And to commemorate 300 years since the pirate Blackbeard's adventures around North Carolina, we have the Plague of Piracy, which includes photos and artifact cast replicas on loan from the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology and the Queen Anne's Revenge Lab, and it's complemented with artifacts from the Country Doctor Museum. Today's presentation is Mariner's Maladies, examining medical equipage from the Queen Anne's Revenge Shipwreck. Our presenter is Dr. Linda F. Carnes-McNaughton, RPA, Archaeologist, Fort Bragg, CRMP. Dr. Carnes-McNaughton has been a volunteer professional on the QAR Shipwreck project since 2006. In 2016, she published Mariner's Maladies, Examining Medical Equipage from the Queen Anne's Revenge Shipwreck in volume 65 of the North Carolina Journal of Archaeology. With Mark Wald-Ramsing, she wrote an overview article titled Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge and Its French Connections in Pieces of 8, More Archaeology of Piracy, published in 2016 by the University of Florida Press. And most recently, her new book, also co-authored with Mark Wald-Ramsing, is titled Blackbeard's Sunken Prize, The 300-Year Voyage of Queen Anne's Revenge, just published by UNC Press, Chapel Hill. Here is Linda Carnes-McNaughton with Mariner's Maladies, examining medical equipage from the Queen Anne's Revenge Shipwreck.
Thank you, Marlena. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for coming out this afternoon. We had a bit of a rainy drive on our way over from Pittsburgh, but we're delighted to be here in this wonderful facility. And as I look out, I think I'm talking mostly to archaeological people and not so much medical people. So don't throw me any hard questions here when we're all done. In the efforts of time, I am going to read this paper to you, and then we'll have time for questions, I believe. Medical treatment for the sick and injured on board a seaboard ship was challenging in the best of times. Ship surgeons and physicians administered to chronic and periodic illnesses, wounds, amputations, toothaches, burns, and other indescribable maladies. I think I even said constipation on the NPR show the other day. The primary person in charge of the treatment and the requisite supplies and tools was the ship's chief surgeon, who may have been aided by a second and third surgeon or aides, sometimes recruited from the ship's crew. Apparently, anyone who could read a recipe was sometimes pressed into action. Their patients were officers, crew members, and in the case of slave ships, the cargo of enslaved Africans. The number of surgeons contracted for a ship depended upon the number of persons on board and the duration of the voyage. Protocols or recipes for treatments were normally property of the surgeon, as well as the capital tools he employed to do the job. The medical chest, stocked with expendables such as drugs, ointments, medicaments, and materials, was often purchased and provided by the ship's owner or captain prior to embarking on the sea voyage, under the supervision of the chief surgeon and a hired apothecary. And this information is according to the Sivata Mecum of 1707 and other sources. Specific responsibilities were expected of the surgeon and his team as contracted by the ship's owner or captain. This brief study focuses on one particular and well-known shipwreck, Queen Anne's Revenge, known better as the last flagship of Edward Teach or Blackbeard. As a brief background, this ship was grounded on a hidden sandbar in Topsail Inlet on or about 10th of June, 1718. This wrecking has been described through historical records and eyewitness accounts as a slow wrecking event, meaning that crew members and some, but clearly not all, of those conscripted passengers had ample time to remove whatever portable items could be extracted prior to abandonment. Eventually, Blackbeard and some of his loyal crew fled the scene in a smaller second support vessel, only later to be apprehended and killed near Ocracoke Island by naval forces commanded by Lieutenant Robert Maynard. A couple of hundred crew members were left to fend for themselves, making it to shore and catching a ride elsewhere. Some were later caught and tried for piracy, then hanged. But let's back up just a moment and talk about how Blackbeard came to have this ship. Originally known as La Concorde, this French slave vessel, captained by Pierre Dosset, left Nantes carrying a crew of 75, including the 3 surgeons, headed to the west coast of Africa on its 3rd voyage of a slave trade. Originally built as a merchant ship sometime around 1709, no definitive date yet, it had completed 2 prior voyages in 1713 and 1715 as a slave cargo vessel. On this trip, Concorde retrieved a cargo of 516 slaves, though many died along the way, what's called the Middle Passage. The ship was taken by Captain Teach and his pirates on the 17th of November, 1717, as it performed its 3rd Middle Passage near the island of Martinique. This background is important to consider regarding the archaeological record of the shipwreck and its resultant artifact assemblage, some of which we'll take a closer look at now. Once Blackbeard captured this vessel, he offloaded most of the remaining slaves and French crew he did not wish to take along for the ride. But he retained, or kidnapped if you prefer that word, 10 individuals he felt were critical to continuing his mission of piracy in the Atlantic. He renamed the ship Queen Anne's Revenge to honor his former monarch, who died in 1714, and perhaps as a touch of political satire, as he was not a big fan of George I of Hanover, her immediate successor. Court records and eyewitness accounts and newspaper articles following the murder of Blackbeard and the capture of his crew members on November 22, 1718, provide valuable historical data from which to better understand the grounding scene and its immediate aftermath. Additionally, the original 1717 muster rolls of the French crewmen of La Concorde provided names, origins, and duties of each person on board, including pay. This discussion addresses from an archaeological perspective what life on board the ship may have been like for both the crew and the passengers prior to their death by natural and cultural factors. Put simply, what were their maladies and how were they treated and by whom? Since the QAR discovery in November of 1996, a lot of things seem to happen in November, I noticed. And here I am. In the shallow waters of what is now called Beaufort Inlet, the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, in partnership with various other state and regional agencies, has completed continuous excavations on about 60% of the site, primarily the stern and the midship areas. The artifacts described today, our medical equipment and materials are available for study because of the careful excavations and subsequent conservation of all items from the wreck. I wish now, of course, to give a nod to the QAR Shipwreck Conservation Laboratory, represented here today by Sarah Watkins-Kinney and a few others perhaps here, located on ECU's West Campus. During field reconnaissance, most large items were piece-plotted in situ in their excavation units, while smaller items, such as mercury droplets and small weights, were subsequently found in laboratory processing of dredge spoil. But before we examine these specialized artifacts, it's beneficial to review the common maladies suffered by pirates and slaves alike in the early 18th century and the documented duties of the ship surgeon. A warning is offered due to the graphic nature of some of these images. So it's not lunchtime, so we should be all right. Medicine in the early 18th century was more of an art than a science. The dawn of germ theory was unrealized. Diagnosis was often difficult, if not impossible, as the outward expression of symptoms of any given disease could widely vary at different stages or at different cases. Successive stages of a disorder would also likely be considered as separate diseases. Such was the case with syphilis. In general, symptoms were treated rather than the underlying causes. Symptoms were apparent, while causes were frequently shrouded in mystery. Generalized descriptions of various disorders may have been commonly described as a violent bilibus fever, a grievous pain in the bowels, a putrid sore throat, or a gross and phlegmatic constitution, whereas accidents and injuries were often more obvious to the patient as well as the surgeon. Medical philosophy of the day considered that when the body was diseased, it was said to have reached an imbalance in the four humors of natural elements, air, water, fire, and earth, as indicated by the body's dry, moist, hot, and cold condition, respectively. Such symptoms were considered an imbalance of the body humors. These humors were related to the natural fluids of the body, the sanguine, or blood, the phlegmatic, or phlegm, the choleric, yellow bile, and the melancholic, the black bile, were considered seated in the heart, the brain, the liver, and the spleen. These were derived from Claudius Galen's theory of humorism that dates back to AD 200. Thus, the common cures for imbalance were often geared towards bleed, sweat, vomit, and purge, just like the beginning of a football game, right? Methods to return the body to the balance. While these traditional practices continued full-blown into the 18th century, some important new advances occurred which ushered in the Age of Enlightenment. French, German, and British medical practitioners, through experimentation and exploration, raised surgery from a mechanical skill to a science. Early physicians were considered medical philosophers, while surgeons and apothecaries performed the requisite medical task. Or put another way, physicians treated while surgeons cut. For the ancient and not so ancient mariners, acute diseases such as fevers, such as tropical diseases like malaria, yellow fever, and influenza, contagions like smallpox, diphtheria, strep throat, measles, consumption, and syphilis, fluxes, also known as diarrhea, and dysentery were very common. Bloody flux, commonly known as amoebic dysentery, was essentially a wasting disease. If left untreated, the body became acutely dehydrated. Scurvy, an avitaminosis disease, which occurred on most ships, impacted mariners as well as enslaved Africans in the cargo. During this era, the problem with habitually bad health started with poor provisions on board, where the provisioning of fresh food and clean drinking water proved very difficult. Most foods were dried and reconstituted, and sometimes without fresh water. Scurvy basically caused the body to rot, creating lethargy and poor blood flow. Lieutenant Francois Arnaud, formerly the officer of La Concorde, upon his return to France, later testified, and this was in 22nd April 1718, how it came to be that Blackbeard was so easily able to take their ship. He declared that the ship was understaffed, having lost, quote, 16 men to disease and another 36 with scurvy and the bloody flux, so that only 21 men of the original 75 crew members remained active to maneuver the vessel, unquote. In other words, it was an easy capture. For the German sailors and even Captain James Cook, scurvy proved less a problem because they stored and ate pickled sauerkraut, which provided critical vitamins to their daily diet. For other Europeans, it was not until the early 1750s that Scottish doctor James Lynn's final experiments discovered the use of citrus fluids to stem the impact of scurvy on these long sea voyages. The high incidence of syphilis and other sexually transmitted venereal diseases among pirates and the enslaved Africans was well documented through numerous historical accounts. Called the foul disease by some, it was called the French disease by the British, and the Italian disease by the French. At the time, medical practitioners believed that gonorrhea and syphilis were the same illness, with the former being an early state for the latter. Regardless, the foul disease was a very real-life threat to pirate crews, for which the only treatment, mind you, not the cure, was mercury injected into the male urethra or put into a paste and applied topically to infected areas. The refrain, "A night with Venus is a lifetime with Mercury," became well known during this period. It may have been that the prevalence of this one disease among Blackbeard's crew, which prompted him to kidnap and hold for ransom members of Charleston's important families, while he blockaded the port and demanded a medical chest with critical supplies. And this happened on the 22nd of May, 1718. It may also be the primary reason he chose to retain those 3 French surgeons when he captured the Concorde. Syphilis, sometimes called the great intimidator, is that right? Imitator, thank you. It could intimidate. Blackbeard was intimidating. Syphilis was the imitator. Can present itself in 4 different stages: primary, secondary, latent, and tertiary. First, cankers form on the skin, which may heal, leaving pox marks. Then 6 to 8 weeks later, the victim would develop flu-like symptoms and a skin rash. After treatment, the symptoms abated and became dormant. The final stage of the disease attacks all bodily systems, causing lameness, blindness, madness, and eventually death. Among many who chronicled the spread of the disease was LaSalle's nearby early journalist Henri Joutel, who in 1684 described the disease in the Caribbean this way, quote, "The air is bad, the fruit is the same, and there are a great many women who are worse than the air or the fruit," unquote. Visits to the west coast of Africa and the Caribbean kept the disease active throughout the 17th, 18th, and the 19th century. Another common side effect of syphilis is the blockage of urinary tract. Special equipment called a catheter was used to open the channel and remove, if possible, any stones or gravel. While no such implement has yet to be found in the QAR shipwreck, Bruceth and Turner described the remains of a silver catheter, 4.5 inches long, found on the LaBelle shipwreck, also along with a hollow pewter rod believed to have been a surgical irrigator or a siphon. Other medical equipment found on LaBelle shipwreck will be considered in just a moment. And finally, part of every pirate's milieu were the periodic wounds from guns and bladed weapons, burns, splinters, bone breaks, and concussions which resulted from warfare on the water. Cleaning wounds first required septics to stem the bleeding, followed by cleansing solutions, then more medicaments to ward off mortification or gangrene or infection. A tenaculum was used to pierce and draw together arteries for tying off. Suturing required a scalpel and a sharp knife to remove damaged tissues, then separation with a retractor. Then a thread and a needle, typically made of non-corrosive silver or brass, and scissors were used to sew it up and snip the threads. Cauterizing irons were employed to singe the cut flesh, seal off the blood vessels, and allow for a cleaner wound. Extractors were used to remove lead shot from the wound. Pliers were used to remove sharp objects like splinters or nails or spikes from Langrange or from other wounds. In the case of a severe wound, amputation was practiced in an effort to save the victim's life. Breaks were set with splints and plaster compounds. Burns were treated with unguents and salves. It has been stated that privateering vessels were many, but physicians and surgeons were few. If no surgeon was on board, the captain or one of the officers was responsible for administering to the wounded or the sick. Given that most medicine chests contain recipe books and vials of chemicals numbered in order to follow a recipe, anyone who could read was pressed into service to aid the afflicted. During battle, the surgeon and his aides would prepare a place near the aft hold to perform triage and later surgeries for the injured. The surgeon would lay out his capital instruments and supplies as the battle began. Buckets of clean water, if you could find it, would also be located nearby. Compresses, needles, and ligatures, splints, were required along with wine, brandy, vinegar, grog, and punch to dull the patient's pain. After battle, the surgeon would report to the captain on casualties and the nature of the wounds. He would also report on those able to report for duty and any potential contagions on board. Typical 18th century medical chests were provisioned to stock a wide variety of smaller tools and expendables needed to treat the infirmed. These portable wooden chests contain handy ingredients and essential tools needed in the close quarters of sick bay. Fully stocked and inspected prior to the voyage, they required periodic restocking during long periods at sea, or if disease and warfare were rampant. As stated earlier, slave ships were required by the ship's owner or the trade company to have a surgeon on board to inspect and protect the enslaved cargo, as well as provide treatment for the crew and officers. Records from the Civada Mecum of 1707 outlines the duties of the captain and the surgeons and his aides, as well as who is responsible for the medical equipment and supplies. Basically, Vada Mecum is Latin for go with me. It's a type of handbook that describes, it's like a manual or a guidebook, describes basic practices to follow. So here, we'll look at these a little more carefully now. To practice the art of healing by manual operations, treat wounds, fractures, and disorders by surgical means. Basic stuff. The chief surgeon must be approved by 2 master surgeons before boarding the ship, like a certification process. The ship owner must provide the surgeon the medical chest, stocked with drugs, ointments, medicaments, and other supplies used to treat the sick during the voyage. The surgeon must provide the instruments of his profession. The medical chest must be inspected by the master surgeon and an apothecary prior to departure, or be fined 30 livres and damages of demurrer. The shipmaster must verify the surgeon's certification, copy or attestation, and approve the chest contents, or be fined 50 livres. The surgeon of the ship is to inform the ship's master of any contagions on board in order to take measures accordingly. The surgeons are not to receive payment or favors from the sick or the wounded mariners in service of the ship, or be fined. The surgeon is not to leave the vessel in which he engaged prior to completion of the voyage, or pay the biggest fine of all, 100 livres, and damages to the shipmaster. Contract provision number 8 is an important one to consider and may shed new light on the retention or the kidnapping aspect of the French surgeon and his 2 aides, who remained on board La Concorde after Blackbeard and his crew commandeered it. 2 major historical sources provided important information about the identity and the origin of La Concorde surgeon and the aides. First is the official 1717 muster roll prior to the departure from Nantes, France, and the second is a court deposition by the former Lieutenant Ernaud, who again made it back actually and gave testimony before the shipwreck actually happened. This was taken several months after his successful return to France in April of 1718. It is important to point out that there are discrepancies between these two documents beyond the spelling of their names. If I look at it, sometimes I see Dubois, other people have seen Dubois, and Ernaut versus Ernaud. What is equally important is the amount paid to each of these specialists. In Ernaud's post-capture testimony, no mention is made of Nicolas Gautran, the surgeon's aide, also known as the third surgeon, though historical records reveal that he did make it back to France. Instead, Ernaud recalls the third surgeon as Claude Deschênes, who is shown on the 1717 muster as a gunsmith. It may be that he was pressed into service as a medical attendant when many of the crew fell sick. This implies he was literate enough, perhaps, to read medical instruction. Or it could simply mean that Ernaud, who did what at the time of any capture, suffering a little PTSD on the event, he may have made a mistake. His testimony is as follows. The surgeon major, Jean Dubois, from Etienne, was paid 50 livres for his service. The second surgeon, Marc Bouquenoff, and forgive my French, please, of La Rochelle, paid 30 livres for his service. The third surgeon, Claude Deschênes, shown as the gunsmith on the muster, was paid 22 livres. The surgeon's aide, Nicolas Gautran, listed on the muster but not mentioned in the court records, was paid 12. Not much else is known at this time about these men and their lives before or after the encounter with Blackbeard. Research by Moore and others indicate that all four men made it back to France and were not tried because they had been forced by the pirates to stay on board. All right, at last the artifacts. Given the maker's marks on most of the medical equipment thus far found on the 1718 QAR shipwreck, it is likely that these items represented the capital equipment and property of the chief surgeon and his aides, and not what Blackbeard stole from Charleston or other prizes. Also bearing in mind that after 300 years of burial at sea, not many of the organics or chemical elements would still be around to be retrieved through archaeology. Among the essential tools of a surgeon or an apothecary was the mortar and pestle used to grind ingredients and prepare compounds for treatment of the sick and wounded. In fact, it is the Walgreens drugstore symbol. It is the universal symbol of medicine still today. This cast iron tool set with no discernible marks was found in the midship area of the shipwreck. The mortar measures 4.5 inches in height and 5 inches in diameter. Ceramic galley pots, represented by the faience sherds on the left, would be filled with unguents, salves, balms, and potions kept on board. The overall pinkish paste and general shape of this pot suggests it was French in origin, 1700-1750. Galley pots with grease paste and a foul odor have been recovered on the Labelle, as reported by Bruceth and Turner. Galley pots also were called apothecary jars, and they were made with flat bases for stability, were often covered with a cloth and secured with a string around the rim. So you see the museum example on the right here is an intact piece. Smaller sizes would fit neatly into the wooden medicine chest for travel. Early in the QAR excavations, a pewter urethral syringe was found and the maker's mark identified as a Paris trademark. The particular angled funnel or nozzle and distinct mark on the plunger point to Saint Laurent Chantelane, a martyred saint who was then grilled. Such is part of the symbol of that maker's mark. The date of manufacturing is 1707. Traces of mercury were detected through chemical analysis, and recall, mercury was the popular treatment for syphilis among sailors, pirates, and the enslaved Africans as well. Mercury could also be applied topically as an ointment to the cankers and exposed sores. Mercury did not, however, provide a cure, but was in fact poisonous. To ensure that compounds for medicines weights were commonly among items in the surgeon's kit, and they were used by merchants also to measure precious metals. 2 sets of nesting weights have been recovered from the shipwreck, perhaps more now. The basic principle behind these weight sets was the compact assemblage of graduated cups fitted tightly together into each other, with the largest master cup forming the outer base and often having a hinged lid to keep the little measuring cups intact as a set. The weight of the largest cup is equal to the sum of all the smaller cups, and the second largest cup weighed the total of the sum smaller cups within it, sort of in that graduated category. This graduated weight system continues down to the final weight, which was essentially a very small solid disc. Historian Diana Crawford Higgins from the Mary Rose Shipwreck Project commented on the fleur-de-lis marks on this set as French in origin, but they had also appeared on other cultural settings since the Middle Ages. The numbers 1, 2, 4, and 8 appeared stamped on the interior base of the graduated cups, denoting weight and size. Welsh also noted a similar set found on the shipwreck Maidstone. Finally, the touch mark on the master cup, which is on the far right there, cartouche of a dot dotted by the initials N and C, we now have identified to the town of Montpierre, which again is where the customs officer would have stamped it and checked the weights. Not necessarily totally manufactured there, but definitely it went through the customs inspection there. After 1717, the ship's surgeons would have included a screw tourniquet invented by French surgeon Jean-Louis Petit, used to stem the bleeding during amputations. Though nothing of the woven cloth binding has survived, various sets of brass thumb sets could represent some of these fittings for a tourniquet device. We're not completely sold on that yet, but we may find elements of this particular tool. Similar ones have been also found in navigational equipment. That's the brass thumb screws. Also shown in the period illustration of tourniquet is an amputation saw. If they were made of iron, they too would not survive the 300 years of seawater submersion. Okay, here's some fun. For several centuries and in several cultures, a universally common treatment for fluxes, fevers, syphilis, and intestinal disorders was the use of a pump clister. This specialized device was used to deliver liquid medical enemas to the afflicted, to relieve ailments, cleanse the colon, and inject medicines for quick absorption. Depending on the nature of the ailment, various compounds and concoctions were mixed and administered by way of clistering. This medical procedure has been documented in use for many centuries, as seen in this 15th century woodcut from Bruges, Belgium. The term clister is synonymous with enema. In the 16th century, tubes for clisters were made of wooden reeds or metal, like silver or pewter, and sometimes ivory. Compounds included ingredients such as cork ash, chamomile, tobacco, oils, brandy, wine, laudanum, even paregoric if available, and vinegar, a common astringent. The type of clisters found on the QAR shipwreck are referred to as piston clisters because of their design. The stern region of the QAR shipwreck, we found the remains of 3 pewter clisters in this area. The parts include cylindrical chamber with a threaded cap, fitted with a pump handle plunger at one end and a tapered nozzle at the other. And here you see just one example, actually 2 examples there, of the QAR clisters. The pewter clister shown here was identified by its maker's mark as being made in Rouen in the year 1697. The second mark on this piece represents a duck and is symbolic of the Canu family of pewterers who operated between 1659 and 1701. By the 17th century, the clister had gained popularity among the wealthy upper class and nobility of Europe, but soon they were popular among other elites, marking this century as the golden age of the clister. At this peak of popularity, it was not uncommon to have 3 or 4 enemas per day, and let that sink in, administered by an apothecary or a doctor to gain the full benefits of body purity and youthful appearance. It has been noted that Louis XIV of France had over 2,000 enemas during his reign, sometimes holding court while the procedure was in process. Bloodletting was another common practice to restore the body to balance of the humors and dates back to the ancient Greek, Egypt, and eventually into Europe. It persisted well into the 20th century as well. Sometimes this practice was accomplished by the applications of live leeches, also known as the sanguine suckers, to the patient's skin, allowing the critter to engorge on the blood, and then removing it to a storage jar until the next application. Or blood could be let by venesection, the practice of slicing into a patient's vein or artery to allow blood to flow, often into a container of some type. Though it was thought to release blood pressure by reducing blood volume, in most cases the historical use of bloodletting was eventually harmful, if not fatal, to the patient. Early paintings and woodcuts often show the patient reclined or seated and the surgeon standing as the blood flows from the arm or the leg gushes into a standing by container. In the woodcut you'll see this one here. A crushed pewter porringer recovered from QAR excavations may have served various purposes, including a basin for bleeding, as you see in the period woodcut there. Originally shaped like a bowl, the object had been purposely crushed over a round cylindrical object exactly 5 inches in diameter, suggesting that this food container, this porringer's final use, wasn't as a food container, wasn't as a bleeding bowl, but was a lid for a food canister. This was further evidenced by the rat gnaw marks along the edges of this impromptu lid. Once cleaned and conserved, a maker's mark and owner's initial were discovered on this double-handled bowl. The maker's mark on the handle is IM, separated by fleur-de-lis, set within a cartouche. On the exterior base, the initials D and V appeared apparently double-stamped, which I see this often on pottery as well, which may signify actually the owner. French specialist Philippe Boucault identified the porringer as similar to types found in southern France, with the scroll double handles and the location of the touch mark. He dated it 1675 to 1700. The cable-like trim identified on the base is also seen on porringers from the French town of Metz in France. And I will say, Sarah and I have toyed with this idea too, that of the 10 captives, the 10 French captains, 2 of them had the last name Duval. So one was the pilot and one was a carpenter. We don't know if this was his porringer, but we can sort of hold that thought. Rounding out the surgeon's specialized tool set is a unique tool was identified as a cauterizing iron. The iron rod is tapered at one end with an acorn or plumb bob shaped finial on one end and a squared rat tail handle portion on the other end. It is very lightweight and finely crafted. Period illustrations show such cauterizing sets available to French surgeons of the period. These would have had wooden grips which could be fitted with interchangeable irons, each shape slightly different to perform specialized tasks. One such wooden grip was found on the QAR as well and may have served this purpose, or it could possibly have been for a dirk or a dagger handle. To put the two together has not yet happened. Okay, Sarah? Okay, noted. Okay. Again, cauterizing irons were used to singe the flesh, stem the bleeding, and provide a cleaner wound for faster healing, if you lived past the pain. Following venesection or bloodletting, and for most wounds, the final step involved a threaded needle and scissors to close the wound or suture and snip the threads. Ligatures, or sometimes waxed shoemaker's threads, were used to compress the wound and suture the opening. Topical ointments and salves would be used to dress the wound before bandaging if possible. The silver needle found on the QAR, it's very intriguing to many of us, is 5.5 inches long and may have been part of a surgeon's kit or a sailmaker's tool. The point is it's made out of non-corrosive metal, which is what you would expect on a ship, but it's a little large for suturing, so we're probably going to go with the sailmaker's tool on that. The eyelet handles of a pair of iron scissors used to snip loose threads and cut away sections of cloth was also found in concretion and may have belonged to either the sailmaker or the surgeon. Right, now we're going to shift just a little bit and look at sort of what all this means, this condition, these maladies. Before its capture, La Concorde left the African coast on October 2nd, 1717, headed for the Antilles. On board it carried 516 slaves for sale in the Caribbean. The enslaved Africans were alternately kept in the lower decks, tightly packed on pallets or racks, often chained or shackled, with minimal food, fresh water, or air. Men and women were separated by partitions or bulkheads, sometimes called barricados. On occasion, slaves would be brought on deck to perform tasking or receive punishment, or for entertainment, or for inspection. Given the abysmal conditions, mortality rates of the slaves were significantly high. The ship's surgeons were also charged with routine inspections. As the 1717 letter of William Bay testifies, quote, "Our surgeons examined them well in all kinds, to see that they were sound wind and limb, making them jump, stretch out their arms swiftly, looking into their mouths and into access, and to assess and judge their age," unquote. Before final sale, the slaves were shaved close and sleeked with palm oil. Surgeons would inspect for any lesions, wounds, or signs of syphilis or other contagions, often forced to examine privates of both men and women. Surgeons were also forced to brand the slaves with the ship's logo as property, often marking them on the shoulder or thigh with a mark or lettering. Apparently, women were not burnt too hard. The court testimony of the former Captain Pierre Dosset of 1718, in fact, seems to confirm this routine practice of branding, as he mentions later reclaiming some of the slaves from the island of Martinique, where they were dropped off by Blackbeard, perhaps, and it says in quote, recognizing the ship's mark. Eyewitness accounts of Blackbeard's capture of La Concorde and subsequent court testimonies of the crew provide some interesting statistics on the mortality rates of the enslaved Africans and the crew members during the 3 recorded voyages of this particular ship. The ship's muster records of 1713 and 15 provide data on the number of officers and crew who set sail out of Nantes on each trip. And in the final 1717 voyage, testimony indicated that numerous crew members had died and many others were severely ill, leaving the ship understaffed, which made him easy prey for the pirate. As for the slaves, Blackbeard is said to have retained 60 of them, while he allowed Dosset to transport 374 to Martinique to offload or sale. That would total about 434 slaves of the original 516 who left Africa, and I calculated that at a mortality rate of 8.5%, much less than that of the crew at 21%. Additional in-depth studies of the mortality rates of slaves and crew on the final voyage of the ship are planned for future study and should provide more details on mortality rates at sea. Another follow-up study to this initial research on medical equipment on board the QAR is to compare this assemblage with other shipwrecks of the period and other types of shipwrecks, whether merchant ships, slave ships, or naval ships. This summary chart provides a quick glance of the medical equipment from the Widow shipwreck of 1717, which was lost in a violent storm on Cape Cod, which also, being lost in a violent storm, affects the artifact assemblage in the way that a shipwreck occurs. The other comparative example is a French naval vessel, the Michaud, which was lost in 1757. As work continues on the QAR shipwreck, the remainder of the vessel from the midship towards the bow will hopefully be concluded along with laboratory processing of the concretions off the site. These in tandem should increase the known assemblage of medical equipment and provide more answers to the life and death aboard this shipwreck. In closing, I wish to acknowledge various scholars and researchers who've worked to retrieve, conserve, and document the findings of the shipwreck, and other scholars who have generously shared their knowledge on medical practices and shipwrecks. And finally, I wish to thank ECU Maritime Medical Group for inviting me to come today and share this information with you. And also I wish to acknowledge my co-author and colleague, Dr. Mark Wild-Ramsing, who knuckled down with me in 2015, and we produced a book Basically analyzing everything that we could in the 60% of the shipwreck that is available. So that is me done. Thank you for your attention.
If you have any questions for Linda, please speak into the microphone so we can hear you on the recording. Okay?
This is actually one I've had for a while, and I keep forgetting to ask it. So we know mercury doesn't cure syphilis, and yet they keep using it. Does it provide some temporary relief, or what?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I think it abates topical symptoms, and it makes them sort of appear to disappear, but it's not a cure. Unless somebody, a medical person here might know more about that, Charlie, but no, to my understanding, it doesn't.
Okay.
And we don't know about the contents of the clysters. I think that's one area of analysis that the Conservation Lab has been looking at, is looking at what has come out perhaps of the clysters and see what kind of medicaments might still be lingering in the gasket, the fibrous gasket of that, to see if they can find any evidence of what would be administered in those implements. More, stand by.
Hi. With the, sorry, I can't see you.
That's all right. I see you, Sarah.
The largest nesting weight that has the touch mark from Montpellier, do you think that the set is a Nuremberg set that was imported into France and then touched, or was it a French set that was?
What I have understood now is that most of those are made in Nuremberg. In fact, the vernacular is called a Nuremberg set, but that different in countries, custom officers would then weigh them and calculate them and put their stamp on them. So I believe you're on, I agree. I think they're Nuremberg. Sarah?
There is no answer to this question, but because we don't know, but listening to you talk, I'm beginning to wonder when the surgeon may have left the ship and why he left his medical chest behind.
Right.
And I was just wondering if you'd had any thoughts on those.
Well, I emphasized it in the talk that I think when the call to abandon ship went out across the water, I think those who had a choice took what they could. They took workable weapons, they took some clothing, they took what they could. But I think others had no choice. I think they were simply forced off the ship. And I think these things were left behind.
So that was June 1718. June 1718.
Yes.
Okay.
On or about
Do we
the
know
10th
when
of
he
June.
got back to Nantes? I don't think.
Yes, we do know. Well, we know, yes, we do know when some of them got back to Nantes and gave testimony.
If you haven't signed in yet, please sign in. Please head to the back and get more refreshments and check out the books on the table. And thank you so much for coming today.